Hi, this is John in the Janus service bay here. We're going to be going over carburetor cleaning today. We're doing this on one of our shop bikes. This is H01, one of our early bikes with the beautiful white sidewall tires. The carburetor's fine on it, but we're going to be using this as a demonstration. I'm going to show you what tools you'll need for this. We have a Phillips screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, 10 millimeter, 7 millimeter, something to drain the gas into, some parts cleaner, and air nozzle from our air compressor. We're going to start off by draining the gas that is currently in the carburetor. So we'll make sure the petcock is turned off right there. And then we'll come around to this side. And the gas is drained from the bottom of the carburetor through this hose. It comes right out of the bottom. So I'm going to pull the hose off to the side here where I can get it into this container. So I'll put that in there. And then there is a screw, a flathead screw right here at the bottom of the float bowl. And you just need to open that up a few turns. You're not removing it all the way. Just open it up a few turns. And then it drains the gas out from the bottom of the carburetor. We'll let that run until it's all out. And then we can close that back off. If you don't do this ahead of time, then you've got all the gas in the carburetor yet, and when you go to open it up, it's falling out, and you either have to catch it in a rag or just have it spill all over. So I like getting it out of the way first. Now we can close this back up. I'm just going to leave this out because when I pull the carburetor out, that will all come out with it. So now we'll come back around to this side. We're going to be taking off this whole assembly here. We'll be leaving the boot fastened onto the carburetor because it's a lot easier to slide it on and off the air box than it is the carburetor. And then we'll be taking the whole intake manifold off here at the cylinder head. So I'm going to loosen this hose clamp on the boot. And then we have two bolts that hold this on. The top one we take out all the way. And you'd think it would just spin out, but it's not doing it on this one. Okay. That's hitting that, so we'll leave that in until we start sliding it off. And then we'll go around to the other side. And where the bottom bolt goes through the intake manifold, it's a slotted hole, so we don't have to remove this bolt all the way. We'll just loosen it up to give us room to move it. And pull it back a little bit, so we'll give it like a 1/4 of an inch or so clearance there. There, that looks good. Now we'll slide the whole thing back a little bit to give us clearance to get this out of here. Now see, it slid off the bolt there. And now we can move this. It's still coming against that hose, but it's far enough out of the way, I think we're okay. This piece that fell out is an insulator that fits between the engine and the intake. Notice it's also slotted, so we can easily put that in and out when we're doing that. And the other thing you should pay attention to, we can slide this out of here now, is there are gaskets on each side of this insulator. So this one stayed on the intake, and there's also a gasket here against the head of the engine. So you want to make sure those are still there and they're not damaged at all when you go to reassemble this. Pull the Kickstarter out of the way so we can work with this a little better. Now, if you wanted to remove the carburetor at this point. I mean, we're not doing that, but it's just removing these cables and the fuel line, and then the carburetor comes out. But we're just going to take the bottom, the float bowl, off. And for that, we need the Phillips screwdriver. There are 3 screws, 2 of them here at the front and 1 in the back. Now for those of you, maybe I should have mentioned this before, if you're fortunate enough to live in California, you can't do this. Because of the California emissions regulations, the carburetors need to be tamper-proof, and so these screws that I'm taking out now, we fill with epoxy. And so you cannot take the float bowl off. So if there's any problem with the carburetor for you guys, you're looking at carburetor replacement. Now the bowl slides off here. This plunger that sticks up, that is the accelerator pump. It's activated by the second cable that's coming down here. A piece pushes down against that. And if you look, when you push on that, you see a little gas squirting out. So that confirms that the pump is working. I'll also look inside the bowl to see if there's any kind of debris or dirt. This one looks pretty clean. I'm going to blow it out with compressed air just to make sure we get anything out of it. But that looks good. Now looking back at the carburetor, one thing to be aware of, the float and the float valve. I'm going to go ahead and take this out just to get it out of the way, and so I don't worry about it coming out later. The little shaft that the float pivots on isn't fastened in anyway, and once you get the float bowl off, when the float bowl's on there, it keeps that shaft from coming out. But with that out of the way, the little shaft, if this thing's moving, it just kind of works its way out. You can see it coming out the bottom, and so if you're not careful, you can lose the whole thing. So I'm going to pull that out, and then the float and the float valve come out of there. And just so you see how this is assembled, it's got a rubber tip on it, so unless over time that goes bad, you might want to spray that off to make sure it's all clean. This fits the little tab here. There's a little wire clip that fits over that to hold it in place. Just to show you what I'm talking about, I'll take the cleaner and just spray that off a little bit. Make sure that's clean. Now we'll set that aside. Then the other main points of interest here are the main jet and the pilot jet. We'll unscrew the main jet first. And the main jet screws into an atomizer. And if you'll notice here, that is all coming out as one assembly. The atomizer is coming out with it. The atomizer is this piece, which has some holes to help atomize the fuel as it's going up through there, so you get better vaporization. And the main jet just screws into the bottom of that. So this is what we need the 7mm wrench for. So use that on the atomizer, and then the flat head screwdriver to unscrew the main jet from that. And once you get that started, it'll spin out easily by hand. And what you're looking at these is just to make sure that they're clean. You can see through them. The main jet also has a small hole. I don't think you'll be able to see that in the video, but you can hold that up to light and look through that and make sure there's light going through that. Just to show you how we clean it, I'm going to spray those also with some of this parts cleaner. That, and the jet. Nice spray coming out of that, that looks good. Now I'll also remove the pilot jet. Another job for the flat screwdriver. Spin that out. And it's got a much smaller hole than what the main jet is. I can hardly see through it, even being right here with it. But again, I'll spray some cleaner through that. We should be able to see that there's a good spray going through it. Yep, looks good. And you might want to also spray a little cleaner into these openings. This is the float, where the float valve goes, and the main jet, and the pilot jet. And then we will blow all of those out with compressed air as well. The other thing you may have noticed here is this is our idle air adjustment screw. And that we set here at the shop, and you shouldn't ever have to change that. And in fact, you're not supposed to change it. We have our own proprietary tool for setting that. You see the two little pins that go into that. That's not supposed to be available to customers. We occasionally send it out to shops if they need to do some work. But that's what that item is. So we're about ready to put it back together. Now that we've got this all cleaned, we can put the jets back in. Start with the pilot jet. Make sure you get it in the right way. The slotted part of it, end of it, will be out. This is fairly soft metal, so you don't need to crank on it too hard, but we have had a few cases where these came loose after it was assembled, so make sure it's good and snug. I'm going to put the atomizer in first. So screw that in and then tighten it down with a wrench. And then put the main jet into that. And tighten that in. Okay, so we have everything reassembled here, and we're ready to put the float back in and then put the cover on. The gasket fits into a groove here on the float cover. Sometimes that'll stick to the top of it. If it does, take it off. Inspect it to make sure it's looks good. And there's also, I see there's a little O-ring that fits over this. This jet is involved with the accelerator pump. And that is not there, so it must have stuck to the bottom. There it is right here. So I'll pull that off. And I'll put that into position here on the cover. So we'll get the float valve assembly back in. We'll put our float back in place. Put the valve over that tab. There we go. The wire there fits over the bottom of that. Hold that in place with my finger and fit it back into that assembly there. And then, while I hold that with one hand, I'll take this shaft and insert it back through here. And I get everything lined up. There we go. Okay. And the float level, you can see the float valve in there going up and down with the float. When the float is level with the carburetor, that should be where it shuts off, and you'll see it quits moving there. We come down below that, the valve is opening. So that's a way to check that you have the proper float level. So now we can put the cover back on. This part you need to make sure fits under this flat piece here, because that's what pushes down on it to activate the accelerator pump. So when you assemble it, make sure that that is up, and this gets underneath that. You can check that by pushing that. That looks good. Okay, so we're back in place. We can put the screws back in. First one I'll just put in, not very tight, just to hold it in place while I get the others in. And by the time we get to the third one, we can go ahead and tighten that one down. Okay. Now we're ready to slide this whole assembly back into place on the engine. We'll double check our gaskets, make sure those are good. That one looks good. That one looks good. So we'll start by sliding this back over the air intake, or the air box tubing there. The boot should slide back on there pretty easily. The one thing that can get in the way here is a little lock washer on this bottom bolt. It tends to work its way down. It needs to be back up against the head for everything to fit together. So I'll get this up in the general position, and I'll take this insulator, and you have to make sure you have this pivoted right. The slot, of course, goes down to the bottom, but there are also these notches, whatever, on it. And make sure you have them lined up with the notches on the intake and the head. So this one needs to go this way to match the notch coming up on that side. That goes down over the notch, and then this. Fits down. And because we've got the hose clamp is in the wrong place here, it gives us some problems with this bolt. So this one's a little harder to get everything positioned back. There, we got that. There we go. Okay, now when things get lined up, you can get this bolt started. We can go ahead and tighten this bolt back down. And again, these are small bolts and going into aluminum, so don't have to crank on those very hard. Go around the other side where you can get the bottom one. Okay, while I'm here, I'm also going to reroute that drain hose that we worked with earlier. That'll probably be sticking out the other side from having that float cover off. Just run it back down behind the engine. It doesn't go through any clips or anything, so it just runs down behind the engine. So that gets us done on this side. We'll put our hose clamp back on the boot here. Give the throttle a couple twists, make sure everything is still moving smoothly. That looks good. Let's turn the gas on. check for any leaks. We can tell on this one in the filter there, we can see the gas running in and be able to tell when that shuts off. Okay, that looks good. And now the true test. We'll see if it starts and runs. So other than the demonstrating the true cold-bloodedness of the Janus, I think that sounds good. I think we're good to go. I hope you have luck with yours.